It is my pleasure to introduce Juergen Mayer H. He's our first speaker this afternoon, and he is an architect who focuses on, quote, work at the intersection of architecture, communication, and new technology, end quote. Although he's been in practice since the 1990s, which is a relatively short time in the long careers typical in architecture, he has a remarkably large body of built works, with a wide range of building topologies in a variety of historic settings, from the Metropol Parasol in Seville to commercial and residential infill buildings in various German cities, to public and infrastructure projects, including an airport in Mestia in the Republic of Georgia, a World Heritage Site. While all are undoubtedly his bold, innovative designs, each is sensitive to a very different and distinctive and specific context. And indeed, it is my delight to welcome Juergen Mayer to the podium.
Thanks for making it back after lunch. I know it's a difficult moment, but I'm showing you a lot of pictures that should make you awake again after a nice, relaxing 2-hour break, 1.5-hour break. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure, and what an honor to be part of that list of speakers. I was a little too flattered somehow when I saw that, and I'm very excited to also see these speeches today. I think the variety of what we see today is really impressive. I'm from Berlin, as Tim told you, and I'm from Germany too, which basically means I'm coming from a culture that all talks about appropriateness. The whole history of Berlin in the last couple of years was all about what works as a European city. It shouldn't stand out too much. We want to rebuild a normal city, all of these things. And you can imagine that if you know a little bit our work, it's not a context where we would actually build something. So we had to reach out and try to get work somewhere else. And I think in the long run, this was the big advantage because the network and the exposure kind of is on an international level now. And it also kind of brings in what, when I was studying at Stuttgart University, Cooper Union, and Princeton, architecture was seen as an activator, as something that tries to not see architecture as a background that doesn't do anything. It's a catalyst for urban life. It's a catalyst to rethink what we are doing or how we want to actually spend our time with each other. And architecture has a big role in that. The work is not so much, or the buildings are not so much an answer to a given problem. I see our buildings more as questions. If this is an architecture of today, if this is something where we see a potential to work on our future. And in German, there's a nice combination of words. There is no future without a past. In German, it sounds actually better. Da ist keine Zukunft ohne Herkunft. So in a way, there is a reference, of course, that you build onto a history and you add on it its layerings, as we saw this morning with Nice's lecture. It's a layering that actually builds up and doesn't erase one from the other. So the projects we are involved with now span, of course, contexts, and even now, 20th century, in times of my youth in the 60s and 70s, now becomes kind of a history that gets protected step by step. I mean, things get erased, so the things that remain are becoming more valuable, and therefore we have to be more careful with what's around us. I'm showing you a house in an urban development near Stuttgart, and all the houses around there look the same, basically. So it's a 60s single-family urban development, and the client bought this house, and as you can imagine, the floors and the floor heights are quite low, and also the different room layouts are very different from what we understand today how a family lives. This is as it looks now. We had to replace it because it had asbestos. It was, all the insulation didn't work anymore. We have this whole new category of how to actually preserve our environments inside from the outside. It's a different climate than what you have here in Los Angeles, of course. And he had to stay within an envelope that was very strict. We could only move the height of the roof by 50 centimeters. It's about 1.5 feet, because now you have a little bit of different heights. You have different sound insulations in the floors. You have a different insulation in the roof. But this was the maximum we could actually do. The slope of the roof had to be the same. It was a very kind of restricted envelope to work with. But then when you come inside, you also have to take this new idea how a family lives in an open space that wants to meet. You have, of course, rooms to retreat. But these here are the living room areas where you see it's more about a circulation. It's more about getting around from one room to the other and have an open floor situation here. You see a little bit the buildings here in the back. This is the context where this house had to fit in. So we replaced the existing building. Also, there was no real kind of, I think, architectural significant agenda behind it. But it's a period of the 20th century that we have to watch very carefully. Another project we are involved with, and we just started designing about 5-6 months ago, is a house in San Francisco. It's by Esherick. It's a 50s building, Presidio Heights. On the other corner of that block, you have the Eric Mendelssohn Villa. And here you see the Golden Gate Bridge. So for us, it's a very exciting project, you can imagine, a beautiful view. Similar conditions somehow, a slope, you're facing actually north, the same situation happened with the existing building. But here we have to keep everything as it is. It's 50 years old, just a little more, so everything is landmarked in San Francisco that passes that age. What we are doing is hollowing out the whole plinth underneath here and introducing more rooms and also an art space. The client has an art collection and also wants to host parties. So if the south hits the building, this is facing Golden Gate Bridge, we are hollowing out that underneath part, getting the light into the basement, and also continuing the upper garden down into the lower garden, which is here. I cannot show much more because we just started about 4 months ago with this design process, and it's very complicated to get the variances, to get the permissions, to also talk to the neighbors. The whole set is much more complicated. But important categories were from the very beginning to keep the existing house as it is. It basically has to be dismantled completely to bring in new insulation, to replace the windows with double pane glass and so forth, but it will in the end look exactly the same. This is the canyon that we put in there from the upper garden all the way to the lower garden. It's kind of a seismic shaking wall canyon that runs all the way underneath that building. Some conceptual models only here. Another house that translates the history of the site into a contemporary design is this villa near Stuttgart. It sits actually on the foundation of a building that was there before. The client called us and asked us to redesign his family house. And this is the building. He started building it in 1984, so this was not so old. It was an architect who worked in Jeroen's office, and you see a little bit some traces of that. There was a central column and the radial structural system. But with every child and more money, it got extended. A balcony became a window garden, became an extra room. The pool became a covered roof, a covered pool, and becomes like an even larger spa area. Even in the 90s, he added little Tadao Ando-esque garage to it. So it was kind of a collection of what was kind of fancy or fashionable in the last 20 years in architecture. Materials from travertine to dark marble to granite to white marble, everything was possible. So what we talked about was, in a way, replacing the house, but he was also sentimental, or the family was sentimental about it, because it was basically where they started to, grow a family. And so we said, okay, we keep the foundations more or less, and we take the footprint, and we call this family archaeology. So the new geometry basically grows out of the footprint of these grown floor plans. The lower floor gets duplicated, it grows out, it rotates out of the existing kind of setting footprint, and that's the building as it developed. We were very lucky because this is an industrial building, and the site was also still declared an industrial site. If it would have been on this side, it would have been a residential site, it would need a pitched roof. So we were lucky that the site was just across here and faces this beautiful valley of Neckar. You have the footprint of the existing house, more or less, and then of course it grows and goes larger and smaller. The same up here, and then it rotates out. So the public floor is the central floor here. You enter it on that level, and then you have two private floors, one for the children and spa area, and the upper part for the parents and guests in a small office. And so you see in the foundations, more or less half of what you have here is from the existing building, and the other half is replaced or modified to the current needs of the family. The main building rotates around the central atrium here, and you have 4 rooms. One is the kitchen and dining area, one is an office and reception area, living room, and the entry space. All the cantilevers somehow happen through this rotationing out, and therefore you get this spatial quality, the structural quality of the existing building. Some shots, I haven't been in the building since they moved in. I was not allowed. So all you see is a week before they moved in. This is the central atrium, some furniture to get an idea of the scale of the building. There are also traces of the existing one. For example, this roof, this stone wall here was already found. You see the outside pool, that was also part of the existing building. We developed kind of a technology that looks like it's one blanket that holds down the building, but it's a very complicated set of constructing this, from a wood with a polyurethane coating to stucco to polyurethane on a concrete porous block system for the walls, all the way down to a tartan rubber floor on the grass. So what looks so easy and continuous and so sculptural is actually a very defined and, of course, worked out with the technology of companies and with the knowledge of our engineers to make this kind of look as easy as possible with a really high input of knowledge for how to build it. Another building that kind of refers to the history of the site is a courthouse in Hasselt in Belgium. It's more or less finished. They're going to open it in September this year. What you have in a lot of cities today is an area, kind of an industrial area, infrastructural area that is given up, in this case the cargo part of a train station. It's the existing train station here, and this all development here is new. There's an urban plan by West 8, and the competition asks for the architecture on that master plan. Our building is the first one in a row of buildings along the train tracks here, and there's a park with a garage underneath here. This is the logo of Hasselt, and Hasselt comes from hazelnut trees. And there are 2 hazelnut trees in their city logo. I don't know, do you say logo? Basically, it shows that with 2, there's already communication happening. It's not just 1 tree, but it's actually 2 that starts to become a symbol for a community. And interesting enough, the whole city has 2 high points of the same period. We have the 2 Gothic towers of the church. You have a kind of a twin tower situation, which was the technical town hall from the 60s, last century. And the new urban plan also asks for 2 high points along the train tracks. So there's always kind of these 2 elements talking to each other from each period. Ours is the first one that's built, and you see these 2 towers. We proposed one here, a larger one, and a slower one here. And there were 2 teams who won the competition. One was Swart Jansma from Holland, and our team, A2O Architekten, Lens Us and us. And this is the building now that's there. And you see certain references maybe to the tree. We are using also wood on the outside of the building. The facade is actually a wood structure, laminated wood that's really strong and works also in terms of fire protection and so forth. You have the tower with the offices and the restaurant. On the other side, there are all the court rooms behind it, and here is the part of the technical, of the juristical part of the University of Hasselt. Another context that deals with a kind of a current history or a recent history of our cities are these 2 high-rise projects we won in competitions in Düsseldorf. And Düsseldorf was heavily bombed in the Second World War, but it also got replaced with incredible 50s architecture and 60s buildings. A lot of them are office buildings or headquarters of important German companies. So to build something in that context really asks for high architectural quality. And the city department is very keen on keeping that level also for contemporary projects that get introduced into the city. One side, this is Düsseldorf here, this is Oberkassel, which is kind of the rich part of Düsseldorf. One side here is a hospital from the 70s, and it gets extended with another building, residential high-rise, with the first 6 floors of offices of doctors' offices. And the other one is in the center, again next to the train station, an area that the post office occupied, and is now developed into an urban interior urban central development. We decided to give it a little bit of history, like something that shows that it might come from a different period, but it's of course very contemporary. We have a 5-degree high-rise here, and it's quite up there compared to other angled towers that are that you know. For example, here Pisa, that's 3.97 degrees. We decided to go with 5 degrees. And this is the building. It's a whole block that actually is a rope around a central courtyard, and here would be the high-rise. So this kind of band moves up here, the other one moves up here, so they both hold each other up, and then there's a third one that closes it off. Here would be the main train station. So this whole site was for the post office. They moved out about 5 years ago. And so all these inner city high-value sites now, of course, need for an architecture that doesn't feel it's like new and implemented, but it comes with a certain also program that makes it the lively part of the cities. So one part will be a hotel. This was meant to be some kind of headquarter high-rise, but now they even discussed making this into an apartment building. And then you have gyms, supermarkets, and so forth. If you cross the bridge and go on the other side of Düsseldorf, you see this high-rise here. That's the project I just talked about. But here we talk about another project, which is another high-rise that complements the 70s hospital here. This is the Rhine Valley. And if you know Andreas Gorski's picture, Rhine 2, he took it basically here and across the River Rhine. So it's kind of, for contemporary art, a very special site. And people up here would have somehow that image. And our client already talks to him and sees if he can maybe get reproductions. So he would give that as a gift to each person who buys an apartment at a building. So even art now becomes kind of a sales point, even if it's just a reproduction, but important to locate it on that site. And that's the view, kind of looking back. This opening here would then face back to the other building in the center of the city. If this is all about either urban developments or heritage of maybe the last century, the 20th century, then, and kind of on an urban scale, this is now a project that involves the whole country. We got invited by the president of Georgia, maybe 3-4 years ago, to talk about a project in the center of Tbilisi. That never happened, or at least not for us. Fuxas built it in the end. But it was the beginning of a conversation for a lot of projects that had to be developed in a very high speed, because the country just has to build up all that infrastructure that's necessary to make a country kind of a running, lively country. So now they're building their first highway. They're building a lot of infrastructures like town halls or even gas stations or even supermarkets. So everything somehow is built up from scratch with an immense history. I mean, it's maybe one of the oldest Christian cultures that we have. There are chapels from the 4th century that protected Islam moving into Europe. You have the oldest wine plant that's 2,000 years old in Georgia. Supposedly, it's the oldest wine plant in the world, that's what they say. It also has very strong connections to Europe, but it's on that kind of outpost towards the east. So coming from a post-Soviet reality into a country that now just has to build up their own economy, their own dynamic identity somehow, architecture became a really important part to play off that rich history, but also projects it into a future that we don't really know what's going to happen, but it's a future that can have a face, that can have a different appearance, that can be a sign to the world that something is changing here. So all the blue spots that you see here are possible projects by us. It's kind of an acupunctural treatment of the country. And I was showing you 5 or 6 of those projects that were built already or under construction. So this is the first one. We were asked to design a couple of cafes, pavilions for Batumi and Tbilisi. This one we only sent as a folder, paper folder. And a couple of months later, I get a call if I would like to come again and talk about a town hall project. And I said, well, yes, of course, but what happened to all the other designs that we sent you? Oh, yeah, you can come also to the opening of that cafe. And I said, oh, really? Who built it? Like, how did you build it? I said, oh, let me get back to you tomorrow. And so it was kind of built, and without us knowing about it. So I said, it would be nice if you want to become a Western country that there are copyright issues, there may be some things that you might want to respect. We never get any money for it. So I think that was kind of a really bumpy start, but it might helped us to get a lot of other projects because they felt so bad about it. So what you have here is the sculpture with a screen on it, so for public viewing, and a cafe in the very center of Batumi. It's on the Black Sea coast. All these buildings are later. This is Michele Lucchi, I think a Hyatt hotel. This is a Kempinski. This is a tower, it's called Alphabet Tower. It's just a cafe, panoramic tower. This is a university which has a kind of a, how do you call this, like a wheel? Ferry wheel, no, how do you call it? Yeah. So it's very, it's not that just avant-garde architecture supported. They are projects that look really very, historic with a kind of a twist with reflected glazing or something. You have kind of restoration of old historic buildings. So it's a whole variety, and we might be at the far end of contemporary architectural design here. So that building was built, but when I was taking a plane out of Batumi, I also saw that facade, which kind of faces our building. And I said, again, interesting. And the president said, well, it's kind of a fake Rolex, isn't it? And I said, yeah, maybe being copied is a sign of honor. So again, it was kind of a bumpy start. But since then, we did a lot of projects that became kind of key elements, I think, for the image of Georgia. For example, Sarpi, which is the border station between Turkey and Georgia. It's on the Black Sea again. It's this building down here. And in a way, it becomes the building where the country says hello or goodbye to you. It's something that is the first sign that you see entering Georgia from the Turkish side along the coast. And it's interesting to see also that it wasn't meant to be a building to separate the two countries. It's meant to be a building that brings people together. There are conference rooms that you can rent. There are these terraces that you can watch out onto the sea. It's, of course, a place where you can shop. But it's a place where people actually learn more about each other than a complete separation and a protection. On the Georgian side, you can even be on the beach all the way up to the border, which I think is pretty impressive. And this is something that was a vision brought in from the government to see also how you can ease that relationship with your neighbors. That was maybe for a long time very difficult. This is a section where you see all the checkpoints here, shopping, conference rooms that you can rent. It's somehow a little bit like a business center at an airport. The view from a meeting room onto the Black Sea and the view at night. Another city that became kind of key in looking at the relationship of old heritage buildings and contemporary architecture is Mestia. It's all the way up in the Caucasian mountains. If you take a car, it takes about 9 hours to get up there. Now maybe about around 5 to 6 because they replaced or they renewed the road. But one key element is to get there with an airplane. It's a very small runway and also a very small airport. We asked to design. From the call they called me to, from the moment they called me to the opening was 3.5 months. So again, you see how high speedy that change is happening. This is the building. It has 3 fingers. One is the tower, one is basically the check-in area, and one is a little cafe. And in the back you see Mestia. It's famous for these stone towers because they were either storage or protection or escape when there were enemies coming through that valley. And so this is something that's really important in the image of the city. And we kept our design somehow in the similar proportions with the old buildings. Although it's quite far away, of course, you have the connection between the two. So this is with a telescope, foreground, the airport, background, the existing stone towers. There's also a small town hall. And you can see references maybe to the mountains or the pitched roof. It's something that is set within all these wooden houses that you see in the back, either old or new ones that try to look like old ones. And that's what they do with it around Christmas. And a police station that we also built, the 3rd building in that little town. Another important project is Gori. Gori is the hometown of Stalin. That's why it's famous, or that's why it's known. Here, it's our first site for rest stops along the highway. And the highways are running from Tbilisi all the way down to Poti, which is the more important harbor on the Black Sea coast. Then Batumi is what you saw before, Sarpi. They're building a new town here, Lazika, which I'm showing you in a second. But this new arteria, this highway, is really important for the development of the country. These rest stops are built not only where the highway is already, but they will also build them in parts where there is no highway yet, because they're not just gas stations. They come in with a supermarket, but also with an art space where they show local arts and crafts, and with a possibility for farmers markets, because the local farmers will also have a possibility to make money and sell their goods. So these objects are kind of key elements, or programs, key elements to show the overall country that there is a development happening. Even the parliament has a rule that every 2 months they have to meet in a different city all over Georgia. So they have to build larger rooms, meeting rooms. That's kind of the initial program. But then, of course, these towns all will have larger meeting rooms or communal spaces, which most of them don't have yet. So it's a very interesting way to really do all these different interventions and updates of everyday culture, and the rest stops are just one element of those. When we went there for one opening, I was surprised to hear, but in a way it was a nice proof that for one rest stop they already had 3 applications for having their wedding parties afterwards in the rest stops. And you can imagine, if that happens, how urgent it is to actually bring something new, to bring some kind of just something exciting into this country. In Tbilisi, we are building a villa, 2,500 square meters times 9 makes it square feet. I don't know how much, like 15,000 square feet maybe. It's actually replacing this building here. This is the President Palace. This is 3 years old, the whole building. And they added later on a little glass dome, so it, I think, refers to the Reichstag in Berlin. Now, they can't use it because it's completely sealed and the heat is so strong that it's more or less just a reference to the Berlin Reichstag. But the whole building is really completely new. This is the garden, the presidential garden, and this house is just a facade. The basement is built with these arched, beautiful arched brick walls. These are existing buildings, but this is just a facade to actually give that site an image. So the client asked us to replace that fake facade and make a contemporary building here overlooking the city. And this is a rendering. We are halfway in the concrete works. Actually, I think the concrete works are done, but now they're putting in the facade. So the rendering is this one here, and these are some of the interior shots. So you see, very key elements are now slowly being updated. The city has 2 huge new buildings by Fuchsas. The new prime minister has a building by Shin Takamatsu that's already like 5 to 7 years old. It's a country that is really kind of moving in a very strong direction. It's very small. It's only 3.5 million citizens, and the country is also quite tiny. But you have everything from a beautiful Black Sea coast here to high mountains, skiing, bathing, and a strong agricultural economy is also important for the country. The last project I'm showing you from Georgia is a sculpture in Lazika. The current president had the idea to build a new town for 500,000 people on the Black Sea coast to make it the third important economic center for Georgia. What you have at this point is a boulevard that runs from the beach into the city, future city a little bit, a very small, tiny town hall, a pier, and our sculpture. And that sculpture is somehow the first sign that something will happen here. It's a development to come, and it becomes kind of the visible starting point for this construction of a whole new city. It's a building that references somehow a project, this is the president here, that references kind of the situation here on the water, but also something that's growing. It's kind of an organic structure that shows a kind of a development in the making. And it, of course, gives kind of also a, let's say, a focal point when you're on the beach looking into the water and looking at this project here. It might happen, it might not happen. Lazika is still a plan. And this project in front of Barcelona, of course, would have a different meaning than being lonely in the Black Sea coast, being in the Black Sea along the Black Sea coast. But it will have a lively surrounding at some point in the future. And this is, I think, a very nice sign to show that there is something happening. It's a beginning of a new urban context that needs to be defined and discussed, of course, within the Georgian public and government and developers. I'm showing two more projects now back in Germany that are infill projects, because if the Georgian ones are more kind of acupunctural references to an overall country that needs a complete kind of fresh start. Here in Berlin or in Hamburg, the other project, it's very much about very delicate relationships to your neighbor or negotiations with the landmark departments that are important. Here, it's an apartment building in Berlin, and it sits next to a Baroque building here on the right side. This one here. On the other side, it's still a gap, but it will be filled at some point. If you know Berlin a little bit, this is the Tacheles area just across up here. I think the other this is better. This is the Tacheles area still vacant. This is the Friedrichstadtpalast. It's the largest variety musical stage in Europe, at least. And this is the Baroque building. Berlin is typical for having front buildings with a courtyard and a side wing. So there's always kind of this very deep court that is very kind of green, has big trees, and it's a very nice kind of retreat versus a dense or let's say a kind of a stony street reality in the street life. Our building here takes the front building and a side wing and kind of reaches into the garden part. And for us, it was important to take that green quality, that kind of landscape idea of the court inside into the building, stepping it up step by step, making different terraces and balconies, and therefore creating a certain landscape idea. Even in the apartments, we have these sunken areas that become the living room pits, and take the idea all the way into the interior. This is the building again. We have two elevators and staircases, and then very flexible possibilities to organize the building inside. The facade developed from, let's say, an idea of getting a lot of light into the apartment, at the same time creating a certain discretion element. Because, for example, in the back, if you would be here, you could look into other people's bedrooms or bathrooms, and we wanted to create this kind of shutters that then became the overall element for the whole building, but they would protect the view from the neighbors. So it's all about this getting light in, because it's a very narrow site, at the same time making a kind of a map of different grades of discretion. And that idea then all the way jumped over to the street facade as well, because you have a very similar condition later on with buildings on the other side. It's a peripheral view that's more kind of, in the end, the important way to look at the building rather than this frontal exposure. So that's where you get the light in. That's where you actually try to get a certain airiness into that dense part of Berlin. This is in the back. For example, there would be a bathroom here or a bedroom, and then this develops into the railing as well. Looking up from the back, and again, a street view. This view will be more or less impossible later on because there are buildings across the street. It would be even narrower to the building, and the peripheral view and this kind of sculptural relief of the facade is then much more kind of the image of the building itself. Another infill project is an office building in Hamburg. And it had to replace this building from the 60s, which you couldn't keep up. It was starting to become kind of dangerous. But it sat between two buildings, one from Art Nouveau times, and then one from the 30s, which is this one here. But the whole street was defined by vertical elements, running, even like the 60s buildings all had that. For our building, we took this verticality as kind of the guiding design idea, but we inverted it. We had the windows come out and all the vertical elements being kind of negative. And so the building has these glass elements running down the facade. We used very thick tiles, ceramic tiles with a very thick glazing, so it has a very strong, massive presence. The facade is this side here. But on the other side, it's actually the smallest, the narrowest facade in Hamburg. You can touch both neighboring buildings with both hands. It's 1.60 meters or something like that. There was a small canal here, and so this storage building had a crane that would actually pick up things or drop things on a boat. So the idea of the crane, and the city enforced us to do that, kind of to show that there was a different kind of situation here, a little nose, some kind of sign that reaches out. And this then became this beautiful kind of head of the building, looking towards the Elbphilharmonie and the old Speicherstadt of Hamburg. This is the upper room. You would have this nose back here. These are the office spaces, quite open floor plans. So this is the narrowest facade of Hamburg. And there was basically a canal running into here, which gave this a reason to have access to the water and the boats. This is Metropol Parasol. It's our maybe most complex project and brings a lot of things together that you saw in the earlier work. It's a very sculptural intervention, yet it becomes a roof that covers urban life in a very kind of playful way. At the same time, it's so necessary to do something there, or it was so necessary to do something there. We won the competition in 2004. It's this side here. It's in the very center of the urban plan of Seville. This is how it sits here. Seville, which you saw before in Rafael Muneo's lecture, has such a rich history of important buildings. It has some open plazas, but more importantly, it has all these really important institutions that define that inner fabric. Suppose it's the largest medieval town center in Europe, and then you have these big institutions that are defining public or communal spaces. So Metropol Parasol replaces the former market. There was a food market there who had to be torn down, or was torn down in the 70s, because it also became kind of dangerous to be in these buildings. Maybe today you would try to save them. At that time, the idea of a car and a contemporary city was more important. But when we were asked, or when we actually started to work on the competition, it was kind of a shady area north of Plaza de la Encarnación. The southern part was all well developed. It had, this is, I think, Rafael Nebo, no, this is your side, right? This is kind of, the southern part had all the institutions, the church, the town hall, the shopping, the bullfight ring, and so forth, the university. The northern part was a little shady. All that happened. It became better after we started with this one, but it was a whole general agenda the city introduced. The whole Alameda Plaza was completely renewed. The public squares got new features. And the whole city kind of underwent a whole change. For example, when we got there, you could still have musicians at 3, 4 in the morning going through the city and playing in front of bars. That's not allowed anymore. You would have botellones, I think, where kids would meet with beers in the streets and just have their own parties, and that's not allowed anymore. So also a lot of regulations on noise and how you can or should not behave in public spaces are introduced. The project here, Metropol Parasol, came with a couple of hopes to change the idea of Seville or the image of Seville. First of all, to bring that development into the northern part of Seville to make it also more of a nice place to live and work. Also the economic potential of here into the northern part. Of course, Seville wanted to compete with other cities in Spain, like Valencia or Tenerife or Barcelona, of course. And then to attract international tourism and business and show that they are part of a 21st century culture. So this was the situation when the competition was announced. The idea to build a parking garage, which was started to be built, 40-meter deep walls. They took out the earth, they found all these Roman ruins, 6-meter deep. That's when the whole project stopped and the competition was launched. This was the site, this was actually the market before it was torn down. So you see it was already a building there. There was no real public space. It was basically a market before it was a cloister. So city fabric was torn down to build different kinds of institutions there. This was the market. Then it was a temporary parking spot for about 30 years. And then we came with our Metropol Parasol. The competition was internationally open. It was a very kind of transparent process. All the 10 projects selected from the first anonymous phase had to go to Seville. We all presented our work. It was responded. We had to present it to each other, but also to the public. And then every drawing, every text was also available on the internet. For us, it was important to see how people reacted and how it was discussed. And for the city, it was important to see if there were projects that had the support of the people that would actually be inspiring for the people of Seville. And ours was the most kind of enthusiastically discussed one, and I think that was maybe part of why we won the project in the end. So there are references that were important for us. A plaza just next door with these huge, beautiful trees. The roof of the cathedral, this beautiful undulated stone ceiling, and the structure then, of course, of the cathedral, similar in height or in dimension. The layering of the project includes the Roman findings here in the basement as an archaeology museum, introducing back the food market and some other commercial areas, an elevated roof for special events, then the roof, the parasol with a restaurant and a skywalk. Everything that you see here in beige couldn't be touched, but then we could introduce some foundations, and these are the plans for the Roman ruins in the basement. Here you see the dimension again. This is the museum level. This is the market level, an elevated plaza, these parasols, restaurant, and skywalk. Everything that's in beige here, and I'm showing this because a lot of people ask us, how actually did you build this thing? It's a timber construction, the largest one in the world, as we are told by our engineers. And this is somehow how we got to it step by step. This looks easier and was easier than really building the whole thing. We had to find a way to bridge the forces from one element to the other, and this was the most crucial part, and that's why the construction actually took so long to figure out how that works. We have steel joints, and then these steel rods that go into the wood about 50 centimeters to 1 meter, like 3 feet. And they had to be glued in because otherwise the forces from the steel into the wood would not work. That glue was just developed about 4 years ago, and this is how it looks. And in the end, it also became somehow the largest glued building, like bonding technology introduced into construction. So the whole building is actually put together by wood pieces, except for all the basement and some areas where we had to bring in concrete for earthquake issues and fire codes. So the wood comes from Finland. It was assembled and cut in Munich, brought to Seville, sprayed on with the polyurethane that makes it weather protected and also saves about 2 centimeters, 1 inch on each side of weather protection in the wood. And brought to the site, put together. The logistics, of course, you can imagine, are really difficult. 2 cores for elevators because of earthquake issues. It had to be in concrete. And then assembled on site. now when you see it, it really works well with the historic environment and the building, the context. You have some existing buildings here. The shadow, which was the very first idea when we introduced that to the competition brief, maybe it's only possible to be out there if you have these shading devices. And the shadow, the imprint basically of the sun onto the ground is the guiding kind of design, maybe the most important design part. This is at around noon, and later on it looks different. So it's also constantly in change, in transformation. When you look at it from Bing Maps, it's hardly visible. It's a very light building, but of course, when you're on the street level, it has a certain presence. The dialogue with the existing buildings are always very important. Maybe another little anecdote. When we won the competition, most people were enthusiastic about it. Of course, we had to talk to the landmark department and all kinds of different interest groups of the city, to VIP clubs. I went to schools to talk to students and so forth. But then I got one letter from a German guy from Seville. Said, like, I'm here to represent the German Spanish trade, society. And I'm also member of the neighboring city community, like just basically maybe 600 feet away from here. And I cannot believe that you're introducing this project to our beautiful city and so forth. And it was like going on, and we will use all our contacts to the UNESCO. So basically, a guy who was there to support German economy to be exported was the only one who was really fighting our project. In the end, of course, I could not even respond to it. It was so like out of place. But it was interesting how different. Let's say he might have moved there because he liked the kind of the rotten quality of Seville in this part of the town. But of course, the civilians really were looking for something new, because hardly anything happened since the Expo in '92. And this was a way to give the city a certain dynamic and a future again. Then another strong voice against our project was the organizers of Semana Santa, which is the Catholic processions the week before Easter. But last year it was on their cover, so it couldn't be so bad anymore. Then for Christmas, it was the market. This is the procession, Semana Santa. Of course, they use it for orchestras and music, flamenco festivals, for very cheesy music videos, Latino pop. It works for hip hop too. Public viewing, Eurogames last year in June. An action movie and shooting on it, and advertising for Gay Pride and for Cartoon Festival. And of course, you had all the demonstrations that happened last year in Spain. They make their own logo out of it. So it's really impressive to see how it gets transformed by appropriation, about taking it and moving it and making it their own. And I think that's the strong quality of the city and of that project in the city. You have all these meetings, sit-ins, big demonstrations, concerts, the Indignados, the Revolucion last year. And what was interesting, that even the architecture organized the demonstration. So one column was for the kitchen, for food. One was for Wi-Fi and discussions. I'm done in 2 minutes. One was for getting organized, whatever. So the architecture, there was a whole plan where each foot of the parasol actually had a different kind of program. And then even people were allowed to sleep there. And I think that's quite touching when you see how architecture, creates a certain trust that you can even sleep underneath it and be part of the outdoors in an urban context. Thank you very much. I hope that gave you a little bit of an insight.